My name's Walt Brennan. Was an offshore engineer for 11 years before any of this started. Designed mooring systems for floating LNG platforms, semi-submersibles, that kind of thing. Spent half my life on barges, which is probably the only reason I'm alive to tell you this. I want to get the timeline straight in my head before I say any of it out loud, because the truth is, the middle part still doesn't fit together right, even now. There's a gap between things were normal and things were not normal that I keep trying to walk through slow, like checking my footing on a wet deck, and every time I get there, my mind just slides over it like there's nothing to hold on to. So I'll start at the beginning, the real beginning, not the part everybody already knows from the news before the news stopped. I worked out of Port Fourchon, Louisiana, contracting for a couple different outfits, mostly stability and mooring analysis on barges that got converted for offshore wind support, sometimes drilling support equipment. Boring work most days, spreadsheets, load calcs, occasional trip out to a yard to look at hull plating that some welder swore was fine and definitely was not fine. About 4 months before everything went sideways, I started hearing things. Not from the news, from guys at the yard. A welder named Gary, who'd been laid off from a refinery up near Lake Charles, told me there'd been a sickness thing go through one of the man camps. Said 3 guys got sent home with fevers, came back acting wrong, then didn't come back at all. Company said it was a norovirus outbreak. Gary didn't buy it. Said his cousin worked the same camp and wouldn't talk about it on the phone. Just texted him, stay away from anybody coughing blood, and then went quiet for 2 weeks. I didn't think much of it. People say crazy stuff. There's always a guy with a theory. Then in February, my supplier for ballast pumps, company I'd used for 6 years, told me their warehouse in Mobile got shut down because half the staff didn't show up to work, and the half that did show up looked sick, and corporate sent everybody home and wouldn't say when they'd reopen. A week later, that same supplier just stopped answering emails completely. No bankruptcy notice, no auto reply, nothing. Just silence. That's the part that actually got under my skin. Not the rumors, the silence. Companies don't go quiet like that unless something's broken, in a way nobody wants to explain. I started watching things differently after that. Started noticing how the local news kept running the same 3 stories about an unusual flu season, longer than felt normal. Kept noticing how grocery store shelves had weird gaps. Not empty, just thin, like supply trucks were running half loads. Toilet paper was fine. Canned goods were fine. It was meat and dairy that kept running short, like the distribution side of things was breaking down somewhere upstream, and nobody wanted to say it. My ex-wife called this paranoia, back when we still talked. She wasn't wrong to call it that. I am a paranoid person by training, if not by nature. My whole job was finding the failure point before it found you. That's what stability analysis is. You don't design for the day everything goes right. You design for the worst sea state, the worst loading condition, the worst combination of bad luck, and you make sure the structure survives that anyway. After 15 years of thinking that way for a living, it gets hard to turn it off when you go home. So when things started feeling wrong, I didn't post about it online or argue with anybody. I just started quietly buying things. There was a barge sitting in a leased slip out past the bayou that belonged to a client who'd gone under. Decommissioned hull, about 210 feet, flat deck, used to support a drilling tender years back before it got stripped and mothballed. I'd done the original stability assessment on her when she was still in service, knew her inside and out, knew her ballast tanks, knew where the structural members were strong and where they were tired. The leasing company that owned the slip was happy to let me do maintenance work on her for almost nothing a month, because nobody else wanted the liability of a derelict hull sitting there rotting. I told them I was doing corrosion surveys, which, technically, I was. I just didn't mention the part where I was also quietly converting half her cargo holds into water storage and running solar conduit through her superstructure on weekends. I didn't tell anyone what I was actually building, not my brother, not the 2 guys from work I trusted most. Partly because I wasn't sure myself how serious I thought this was, and partly because saying it out loud, I think something's coming, and I'm building a boat to survive it, makes you sound like the guy with the foil hat at the bar. I'd rather be quietly wrong than loudly wrong. The work itself, though, that part I understood completely. That part made sense to me in a way nothing else did anymore. First thing I did was reassess her stability curve, because a barge with no fixed superstructure handles completely differently once you start adding weight up top. I didn't want to build some top-heavy shantytown that'd capsize the first time wake hit her wrong. So I spent 3 weekends just recalculating loading scenarios, figuring out where I could safely add structure and where I couldn't, working it out longhand with a calculator, because I didn't trust putting too much of this on a work laptop that synced to company servers. The hull itself was solid. Steel plate, decent thickness. She'd been built tough, because tenders take a beating. Some surface corrosion on the starboard quarter that I chipped and coated myself over a couple of weekends, breathing through a respirator in 90-degree heat, hands raw from the wire brush. Nobody helps you do that kind of work. Nobody even asks why you're doing it, because nobody's watching a guy doing maintenance on a junk barge. For water, I welded in a closed catchment system off what used to be a deck crane platform, routed it down through PVC into 2 of the converted holds I'd lined and sealed for potable storage. 12,000 gallons total, once both holds were sealed right. Which sounds like a lot, until you actually think through what a person uses in a day for drinking, cooking, washing. I figured maybe 4 months for one person if I was careful. I also picked up a manual reverse osmosis unit, second-hand, off a guy parting out a sailboat that had been repossessed by a marina for unpaid slip fees. Cost me almost nothing, because nobody else at that yard knew what they were looking at. For power, this is where I actually felt useful, in a way that calmed something down in my chest. I scavenged 4 marine solar panels off a wrecked sport fisher that had been sitting condemned at the yard for 2 years, plus bought 2 more new ones outright, because the wrecked ones were already showing some delamination. Wired them into a bank of deep cycle batteries I kept in a sealed locker I built out of an old Connex box welded to the deck, ventilated but weatherproofed. Added a small diesel generator as backup, the kind contractors use, with enough fuel cans stored in a separate locked compartment that I labeled lubricants on the outside, just so nobody glancing at it would think twice. Food I bought slow, over months, never all at once, never from the same store twice in a short stretch, because by then, I'd noticed the inventory gaps getting worse, and I didn't want to be the guy who triggered a panic by buying out a shelf. Canned proteins, rice, dried beans, vacuum-sealed staples, a case of multivitamins, because scurvy is a real and stupid way to die slowly on a boat, and I wasn't going to be that guy. I also picked up 2 decent fishing rods, a cast net, and crab traps, because if this thing actually lasted longer than my stores, fishing was going to matter a lot more than canned chili. I want to be honest about something. Part of me, almost the whole time I was doing this, thought I was being ridiculous. I'd come home some nights with diesel smell baked into my hands, sit at my kitchen table eating cereal because I was too tired to cook, and think, you're spending your savings turning a dead barge into a panic room because some welder's cousin sent a weird text. That's not sane behavior. I knew that. I kept doing it anyway, because the alternative, stopping and being wrong about stopping, felt worse than looking foolish to nobody, since nobody knew. The thing that finally tipped me from quiet hobby project into actually finishing this thing on a deadline was a phone call from my brother Tom in early spring. He called from Houston, voice tight in a way I'd never heard from him. Said the hospital he worked maintenance at had a wing locked down, full lockdown, armed security on the doors, and admin telling staff it was a contamination event, and refusing to elaborate. He said 2 nurses he knew personally just disappeared from the schedule, with no explanation, no termination notice, nothing. He said the patients in that wing were making sounds at night that he didn't want to describe over the phone, and that one of the security guards, a guy he'd known for years, looked at him in the break room and said, "Real quiet, go home, and don't come back until this blows over. Man, I'm serious." Tom told me all this in a rush, like he needed to say it to someone before he convinced himself not to believe it. I remember sitting in my truck in a gas station parking lot, engine off, just listening to him breathe on the other end of the line, after he finished talking. I asked him straight out, "You think this is what I think it is?" He didn't answer that directly. He just said, "I don't know what it is, Walt. I just know I'm scared, and I don't know why everybody around me is acting like it's a normal Tuesday." That call moved my timeline up hard. I went from finish this over the next year, slow and careful, to finish whatever's load-bearing in the next 3 weeks, and figure out the rest after. I took unpaid leave from work, claiming a family emergency, which wasn't technically a lie, since my family was, in fact, an emergency I was trying to prepare for. I spent every waking hour at the yard after that, welding fortification plates over the most vulnerable boarding points on the hull, reinforcing the wheelhouse I'd built up from salvaged steel framing, low profile, nothing that'd draw the eye from a distance, designed more like a thick-walled shed than anything that looked defensible. I didn't want this thing looking like a fortress from shore. I wanted it looking like exactly what it had been. A forgotten, rusting work barge nobody cared about. I asked Tom to come stay with me on it. He hesitated longer than I expected, said he had to think about his wife, his kid, didn't want to scare them by suddenly uprooting based on a feeling. I told him I understood, and I did, but it scared me too, because by then I genuinely believed something bad was coming, and I didn't know how to make someone believe that without sounding unhinged. He never made it to the barge. I want to say that now, early, because I don't want to build this up like it has a happy ending for him, and I don't want to keep circling back to it like a wound I keep poking. He didn't make it. I'll get to how later, because I genuinely can't talk about it yet without losing the thread of everything else, and I need to keep the thread. The outbreak, when it actually hit in a way nobody could keep calling a flu season, didn't arrive like a wave. It arrived like a string of lights going out one bulb at a time, except the bulbs were towns, and then cities, and the gaps between dark spots kept getting shorter. I was at the yard the morning it stopped being deniable, had the radio on while I worked, local AM station, and the host who normally did traffic and weather just started reading emergency broadcast language in a voice that kept cracking. Said there was a, quote, violent illness causing erratic and aggressive behavior, spreading through 3 parishes, said authorities were asking people to shelter in place, said hospitals were over capacity and turning away anyone without obvious physical trauma. Then the broadcast cut to a pre-recorded loop that just kept repeating the same instructions, over and over, no live voice anymore. I remember standing on the deck of my barge, holding a half-finished weld in one hand, and just listening to that loop cycle 4 or 5 times, my brain doing this slow catch-up thing, where I understood the words individually, but couldn't make them add up to something real. I'm not going to pretend I had some clean, decisive moment where I knew exactly what to do. What actually happened is I finished the weld I was working on, because some animal part of my brain decided that whatever was happening, an unfinished structural joint on my only shelter was a problem, and problems get fixed. Then I climbed down, got in my truck, and drove to the grocery store 4 miles from the yard, because my stores weren't full yet, and I figured I had maybe a couple hours before things got bad enough that going into town stopped being an option. The store was already a mess. Not chaos yet. Not what I'd see days later, but wrong. Carts left in the middle of aisles. A woman crying quietly by the registers, while a teenage cashier just stood there, phone in hand, not ringing anyone up. I grabbed 2 carts and moved fast and specific. Canned meat, rice, batteries, a case of bottled water even though I had storage tanks because redundancy is never wasted, basic first aid supplies, antibiotics from the pharmacy counter where nobody was checking anything anymore. There was a man near the meat counter who looked wrong. I noticed him because of how he was standing. This rigid, swaying stillness, head tilted slightly down, like he was listening for something. He had a stain down the front of his shirt that I told myself was barbecue sauce, because that was an easier thing to be true. I gave him a wide path, didn't make eye contact. Some part of my brain that I didn't consciously consult told me very clearly, don't be near that man. I got out of there with both carts, paid in cash because the card reader was down anyway, and drove back to the yard going maybe 20 over the speed limit the whole way, hands sweating on the wheel. By the time I got back, there were already 3 other trucks in the lot near the slip that hadn't been there that morning. People I half recognized from around the marina. Gary, the welder who'd first told me about the man camp sickness, was one of them, standing near my barge with 2 duffel bags and a look on his face like he was trying to decide if he should be embarrassed for showing up uninvited. I want to be straight about this part because it matters for everything after. I didn't build that barge to be a charity. I built it to keep myself and the people I loved alive. But standing there looking at Gary, who I'd known for years, who'd actually been the one whose warnings I'd taken seriously enough to start this whole project in the first place, I couldn't turn him away. Wouldn't have been able to live with that, assuming I lived with anything at all after that week. I told him straight, I've got room for a few people, not a town. I need people who can work, who can follow rules I haven't even written yet because I'm making them up as I go, and who understand that if this gets bad, decisions are going to get made fast, and they don't all get a vote. He said okay before I even finished the sentence. The 2 other trucks belonged to people Gary had brought, which annoyed me at the time, even though I understand now why he did it. You don't leave people behind in a parking lot during something like this, if you can help it. One was a woman named Patricia Ahern, 50s, who turned out to be a retired ER nurse, which honestly might be the single luckiest break in this entire story, given what came after. The other was a younger guy, mid-20s, named Dale Whitfield, who'd worked boats his whole life, knew engines and rigging better than almost anyone I've met since. I made them all stand on the dock while I laid out exactly what I expected, because if I let that conversation happen once we were already moving, the structure of who was in charge would never get established, and that gets people killed later. Told them, this hull is sound. The food and water I've got will stretch with 4 people if we're careful. Work gets shared, theft doesn't happen, violence against each other doesn't happen, and if any of them turned out sick, I'd have to deal with that fast and without sentiment. Patricia nodded, like she already understood that last part better than I did. Dale just said, where do I tie off? We left the slip at maybe 4 in the afternoon, engine running rough, because I hadn't had time to fully service it, black smoke trailing off the stern, and as we pulled out into open water, I watched the shoreline behind us and saw smoke rising from at least 2 separate points in town that hadn't been there that morning. The first night out, nobody slept. We anchored about a mile offshore in water, shallow enough that I could still see the bottom contour on the depth finder, far enough that nothing on land could reach us by walking, close enough that I could still see the lights of town flickering. And then, around midnight, going out in patches, building by building, until whole blocks were just dark. Patricia spent that first night going through the first aid stores, reorganizing them with the kind of brisk, silent focus of someone who needed her hands busy more than she needed to talk. Dale checked every line, every cleat, every weld I'd done myself. Not out of distrust exactly, more like he needed to verify the thing keeping him alive actually worked the way I'd told him. Gary sat on the deck with a rifle he'd brought from his truck, watching the dark water like it owed him an explanation. I didn't sleep either. I sat in the wheelhouse running through stability numbers in my head that I already knew by heart, because doing math felt like the only thing I had control over. Around 2 in the morning, Dale came and got me, voice low and tight, said there was something in the water. I went out and looked where he pointed, and saw a shape moving against the current, not swimming exactly, more like a body being carried, that occasionally thrashed in a way that didn't match drowning. It bumped against a piling about 30 yards off our stern, and in the dim moonlight, I watched it claw its way partially up onto a half-submerged dock piling that'd been knocked loose from somewhere, latch onto it like it had forgotten how joints were supposed to bend, and just stay there, head turning slow in our direction. It made a sound, not a scream, not words, something lower and wetter than that, a kind of grinding moan that traveled across the water clearer than it should have, and every one of us on that deck froze at the exact same moment. Gary raised his rifle. I told him not to fire, because the muzzle flash and noise would do more to give away our position than that thing floating on a piling could ever do to hurt us from there. He lowered it, hands shaking slightly, and we just watched it for almost 20 minutes, until the current finally pulled the piling loose and carried it off into the dark, that moan fading slow until it was just water sounds again. Nobody said anything for a long time after that. Patricia finally broke the silence by saying, very quietly, "That confirms it then." in a tone that wasn't really a question, more like she was filing the fact away somewhere practical, so she could keep functioning. That was the moment, if I'm being honest, that the whole thing stopped being a private paranoid hobby and became the actual shape of the rest of my life. Over the next several days, we worked out a rhythm without really discussing it, the way people do when survival makes the priorities obvious. Dale handled anything mechanical, engine, pumps, the generator, almost compulsively, like keeping busy with bolts and fuel lines was the only thing standing between him and falling apart. Gary took watch duty more than anyone, didn't sleep much, kept that rifle close even when cleaning fish. Patricia ran a tight little medical bay out of what used to be a tool locker, inventorying everything down to individual bandages, teaching the rest of us basic wound care, because she said flat out she wasn't going to be the only person on this boat who knew how to pack a gunshot wound if it came to that. I spent those first days doing what I'm good at, assessing the structure under new load, figuring out exactly how much weight, human, supply, equipment, this hull could safely carry before stability margins got dangerous, and quietly recalculating every safety number I'd worked out alone, now that 4 people lived on it instead of 1. Turns out 4 people use water and produce waste at a rate that made my earlier estimates look almost laughably optimistic. I had to redesign the waste handling within the first week, building a basic composting and filtration setup out of plastic drums, because I hadn't planned for an actual functioning household. We avoided shore almost entirely those first 2 weeks, except for short, fast supply runs that I planned out in advance like military operations. Go in at low light, 2 people only, weapons ready, in and out, in under 20 minutes, never the same location twice. The land had changed faster than any of us expected. Towns that had looked merely chaotic from a distance on day 1 looked abandoned and broken by day 5. Storefronts smashed, cars left running out of gas in the middle of roads, and figures moving in the distance with that same rigid, wrong-footed gait we'd already learned to recognize and avoid. I want to talk for a minute about what those things actually were like up close, because I think people who never saw it picture something smarter than what it actually was. They didn't think, didn't plan, didn't coordinate, didn't show any sign of recognizing each other as anything other than obstacles. They moved toward sound, mostly, sometimes toward movement they could see, and once they latched onto a target, they didn't stop, didn't get tired in any way that mattered on a human timescale, didn't negotiate. They couldn't climb anything technical. We watched 2 of them try repeatedly to get up a half-collapsed boat ramp and just keep falling, getting back up, trying the same useless angle again, like the part of the brain that solves problems had just been switched off entirely. They couldn't open doors with anything more complex than a simple push, couldn't operate a latch, couldn't climb a ladder with rungs spaced for human stride if the angle was steep enough. That predictability is the only reason any of us survived those early weeks, because the second you assumed intelligence behind those eyes, you'd make the wrong call at exactly the wrong moment. That didn't make them less terrifying. If anything, it made them worse in a different way, because there was nothing to reason with, nothing to bargain for, nothing that would ever, under any circumstance, stop on its own. A wild animal might decide you're not worth the risk. These didn't decide anything. They just kept coming until something stopped them physically, and that fact sat in my chest like a stone every single time I had to go back to shore. About 10 days in, we had our first real scare from people, not the infected. And I think this is the part of the story most folks underestimate when they imagine what surviving something like this actually looks like. The infected were a known, predictable danger once you understood the rules. Other survivors were not. We'd anchored near a cluster of marshy islands about 6 miles out, figuring the shallow, twisting channels would keep larger boats from approaching easily and give us warning if anything did. Around dusk on the 10th day, Gary spotted running lights approaching from the southeast. 2 smaller boats, moving fast, moving like they knew exactly where they were going, which told me immediately this wasn't random. I killed our deck lights, told everyone to get below or flat against the gunwale, and watched through binoculars as the 2 boats slowed near the mouth of the channel we'd anchored in. I could hear voices carrying across the water, low, controlled, not panicked, which honestly worried me more than panic would have. Panicked people make mistakes. Controlled people executing a plan don't. One of the boats had a spotlight, and they swept it slow across the marsh grass, working a search pattern, clearly looking for something specific. I made everyone stay dead still. No movement, no sound. And we sat like that for almost 40 minutes, while those lights swept closer, then further, then closer again. Eventually, one of the boats peeled off toward the open water, but the other held position near the channel mouth for almost an hour after dark, engine idling low. I could hear two men talking, close enough now that fragments carried over. Something about a list, something about the barge that left Forshon, and my stomach dropped through the deck. They knew about us. Not specifically where we were, not yet. But they knew a barge had left the area, and they were looking for it on purpose. I never found out exactly who they were that first time, whether they were former dock workers who'd seen me working on the hull for months and guessed what it might become, or something else entirely. What I did learn over the following weeks, putting pieces together from radio chatter and later encounters, was that there were several organized groups operating along that stretch of coast almost from the very start. Groups that had been planning their own version of what I was doing, except with a very different philosophy about how to get supplies. Take rather than build. That night was the first time I genuinely considered that the infected might end up being the smaller problem. We moved at first light, deeper into open water, away from any channel a boat that size could easily follow without serious navigational risk. I plotted a course that put us in water shallow enough to limit who could follow, but deep enough to keep us off any charts those raiders might be using if they'd grabbed old marina records. It was a trade-off I didn't love. Shallower water meant fewer escape routes if something went wrong from another direction. But at that point, every option had a cost, and I just had to pick the one I could live with. Patricia asked me that morning, very directly, what the actual plan was. Not in an accusing way. She just wanted to know if there was one. Because up to that point, we'd been reacting rather than planning. And she was the kind of person who needed a plan to hold on to. I told her the truth. The plan, for now, is survive long enough to figure out a real plan. Build up enough supply margin that we're not making decisions out of desperation. Stay mobile. Stay quiet. Stay armed. And don't trust anyone who finds us until they've proven they're worth trusting. She accepted that better than I expected. Said, that's basically triage. You don't need the whole treatment plan on day one. You just need to keep the patient alive long enough to figure out what's actually wrong. That stuck with me, honestly. Became something close to how I thought about every decision after that. Keep the patient alive. Figure out the rest later. Dale spent that stretch doing something I hadn't asked him to do, which I appreciated more than I told him at the time. He started a logbook. Fuel consumption, water usage, food stores remaining, weather patterns, tidal data, everything. Said he'd worked on boats his whole career where the captain who kept good logs was the captain who didn't die from a problem he should have seen coming 3 weeks earlier. That logbook ended up being one of the most valuable things on that barge, because it let us actually plan instead of guess. We had our first real food crisis around day 18, not because we'd badly miscalculated. My estimates had actually been decent, but because 4 people burned through stores faster under stress than under normal calm planning, and because Gary had quietly been rationing himself smaller portions and giving the difference to the rest of us without saying anything, which I only found out when Patricia noticed he'd lost a visible amount of weight in under 3 weeks and confronted him about it in front of all of us. That led to the first real argument on the boat. Gary got defensive, said he didn't need anyone managing his food intake, that he'd grown up with less and he was fine. Patricia, who does not back down from anybody, told him flatly that fine people don't have visibly hollowing cheeks after 18 days, and that if he collapsed from malnutrition while on watch, he'd get someone else killed along with himself, and that this wasn't a debate, it was medical fact. I had to step in and make it a rule rather than a discussion. Equal rationing, no exceptions, no silent sacrifices, because silent sacrifices on a boat with 4 people and limited stores create blind spots that get people killed. Gary didn't like it. Did it anyway. That was the first time I understood that running this thing wasn't just engineering. It was going to require actually managing people, which I was nowhere near as confident about as I was about hull stress calculations. That same week, we made our first organized scavenging run to an actual marina, rather than a quick grocery grab. And this is where the story starts becoming less about just surviving day to day, and more about actually building something. The marina was about 8 miles up a tidal creek, a place I'd used for fuel before everything fell apart. Mostly recreational slips, a small fuel dock, a chandlery that sold marine parts and basic supplies. I scouted it first with binoculars from a safe distance for almost 2 hours before committing to anything, watching for movement, watching for smoke, watching for any sign either of the infected or other survivors had already claimed it. It looked dead quiet. 3 boats still tied up, looking abandoned, one partially sunk at her slip, with just the bow showing above water. No movement on the docks, no lights. Dale and Gary went in with me on the smaller skiff we'd taken from the barge specifically for runs like this, keeping the barge itself anchored well back and out of sight around a bend in the creek, with Patricia aboard her, armed, with strict instructions that if she heard 3 long blasts on the boat horn from us, she was to leave without waiting. No exceptions, no matter what she heard or thought she heard. That was a hard conversation to have with someone, telling them flatly, if it sounds like we're in trouble, your job is to abandon us, not save us, she argued. I held the line. In the end, she agreed, because she understood the math even if she hated it. 1 barge with full stores surviving was worth infinitely more than 1 barge risking everything, trying to rescue 2 people from a bad situation on shore. The chandlery had been looted already, partially, but whoever did it had been after the obvious stuff. Anything cash valuable, electronics, alcohol, and had left behind a surprising amount of the boring, heavy, actually useful gear. We took 2 spare solar panels still in their boxes, never installed, a working manual water maker that was newer and more efficient than the second-hand one I already had, several coils of line, a case of marine batteries, and an entire shelf of canned goods from the small ship's store, attached to the office that the looters had apparently overlooked or not cared about. We also found in the back office a stack of charts and a logbook from the marina's own harbor master, with handwritten notes from the final days before everyone clearly fled, including a note that read, in shaking handwriting, "They're not all dead. Some of them just changed. Do not let anyone tell you different. God help us." I kept that logbook, still have it. Don't entirely know why, except that it felt wrong to leave behind the last thing someone wrote before whatever happened to them happened. That run took almost 4 hours total, longer than I wanted, and on the way back to the skiff, we encountered our first close-range infected on land rather than in water. It came around the corner of the fuel dock office fast, faster than I expected given how stiff and lurching they'd looked from a distance. Turns out distance flattens a lot of detail, and up close, the speed of an aggressive lunge is a completely different thing to process than a slow shamble seen through binoculars. It had been, from the look of what remained on the body, a man in his 30s, dock attendant uniform half torn away, jaw working in that same wet, grinding way, and it came at Dale before any of us had time to think tactically about it. Dale swung the gaff hook he was carrying for fish on pure reflex, caught it across the side of the head hard enough to drop it, and then, this is the part that still gets me thinking about it, kept hitting it even after it stopped moving, 3, 4 more times, breathing in these short, ragged gasps, until Gary grabbed his arm and physically pulled him back. Nobody said much on the ride back to the barge. Dale's hands didn't stop shaking until we were most of the way there. That was the first time any of us had killed one up close, and I think all 3 of us, in our own private way, understood that we'd just crossed some line that didn't have a way back across it. Patricia met us at the rail when we got back and didn't ask how it went. She just looked at our faces and said, "Okay, get the gear stowed, then everybody eats, then we talk." Which is exactly what we did, and I remember being grateful, in a strange, numb way, for someone on that boat who understood that sometimes the most important thing wasn't talking about what just happened. It was eating something and letting your hands stop shaking first. We installed the new solar panels and water maker over the following days, and having that extra capacity changed the math of the whole operation in a way that mattered more than I expected. More water meant less time spent worrying about rationing, which freed up mental space for actually thinking ahead, instead of just managing the immediate crisis. I started, for the first time since this all started, sketching out an actual long-term layout for the barge, instead of just patching problems as they appeared. A proper rainwater catchment grid across more of the deck, expanded growing beds for whatever vegetables might survive salt air, a real fortified perimeter rather than improvised plating. It was around this time, maybe 3.5 weeks in, that we picked up our 5th survivor. And I want to tell this part carefully, because it's where the story stops being purely about supplies and structure, and starts being about the much harder problem of deciding who you trust with your life. We were running along the edge of a wide bay at dusk, when Gary spotted a figure on a half-collapsed fishing pier, waving something white, frantic, alone as far as any of us could tell through the binoculars. My first instinct was caution bordering on refusal. Every lesson I'd absorbed in 3 weeks told me lone figures waving for help on isolated piers were exactly the kind of bait a raiding group would use to draw a boat in close. But something about the way this person was waving, not organized, not rhythmic, just desperate and uncoordinated, made Patricia speak up before I'd even finished thinking it through. She said, "That doesn't look like a trap, Walt. That looks like someone who's about to die." I trusted her read on people more than my own by that point, mostly because she'd spent decades reading patients in crisis and knew the difference between performance and genuine panic. We approached slow, weapons ready, engine idling low, and found a man in his 60s, alone, dehydrated badly, with a leg wound that had clearly gone untreated for days and was already showing the early dark edges of infection. The regular kind, not the kind that mattered more now, though for one ugly second before Patricia got close enough to examine him properly, none of us knew which kind it was, and I watched Gary's hand drift to his rifle, without him seeming to notice he'd done it. His name was Harold Vance, and his story came out slow over the next several hours, as Patricia worked on his leg. He'd been a retired tugboat captain, had been sheltering with a small group on shore that got overrun 12 days earlier, had been alone since, surviving on rainwater and whatever he could scavenge from abandoned coolers along the shoreline, moving at night, sleeping in the day, in whatever cover he could find. Patricia got the wound cleaned and dressed, started him on the limited antibiotics we had, and made it clear to all of us that the infection in his leg, while serious, was an ordinary bacterial infection from neglect, nothing related to whatever was turning people into the things we were avoiding. That distinction mattered enormously, because if we hadn't been sure, the conversation about what to do with him would have been a very different and much darker one. And I think every one of us on that deck understood, without saying it, how close we'd come to a decision none of us wanted to be the one making. Harold turned out to be one of the best additions we could have asked for. Decades of actual deep water experience, calm under pressure in a way that came from having weathered real storms at sea, rather than just imagining them, and a kind of dry, worn-down humor that somehow made the rest of us laugh for the first time in weeks, which mattered more for morale than any supply run ever could. By the end of our first month on the water, we were 5 people, reasonably stocked, mobile, cautious, and slowly building something that felt less like a desperate escape and more like an actual home, even if that home rode tides instead of sitting on a foundation. But the raiders hadn't forgotten about us, and the next real test of everything I'd built came faster than I expected, and it came at night, which I'd already learned by then was when the worst things in this new world liked to happen. It was the start of our 6th week, anchored in a spot I'd thought was well hidden, a narrow tidal cut between 2 low marsh islands that I'd specifically chosen because the approach was tricky to navigate without local knowledge. Gary had first watch. I was below deck, going over Dale's logbook with him, cross-checking fuel projections, when Gary's voice came down through the hatch, low and urgent. The specific tone we'd all unconsciously agreed meant, "Don't ask questions yet, just move." 2 boats again. The same 2 boats, I was almost certain, judging by the running light configuration, though this time they weren't sweeping a search pattern. They were holding position at the mouth of the cut, engines idling, clearly having found us through means I still don't fully understand to this day. Maybe they'd tracked our fuel runs back to a pattern. Maybe someone on shore had seen us and talked. It didn't matter in the moment. What mattered was 5 boats worth of distance between 2 groups of armed strangers, and my entire life suddenly collapsing down to the next 10 minutes. I made the call fast, Dale to the engine room, ready to move on my signal. No lights. Harold and Gary on the rail with whatever weapons we had. Patricia below with the wounded kit ready, just in case. And me in the wheelhouse, plotting the absolute fastest route out of that cut that didn't run us aground on a sandbar I knew was there. From old charts, but that strangers running fast at night absolutely would not. A spotlight swept across our hull, found us, held. A voice carried across the water, amplified through something. A bullhorn, maybe a phone speaker, calling out that they just wanted to talk, that we should come out peaceful, that resisting would just get people hurt. I'd heard enough about how these groups operated by then, secondhand from Harold's stories about what happened to his shore group before it fell, to know that just wanted to talk from armed strangers in the dark was never actually an offer. I gave Dale the signal. Engine roared up, and I ran as hard toward the sandbar gap I knew was there, narrow enough that I'd need every inch of clearance the barge had, shallow enough that I was genuinely betting our lives on it, that the 2 pursuing boats either didn't know it existed or wouldn't risk it in the dark even if they did. We cleared it by less than 3 feet of water under the keel, by Dale's later estimate, watching the depth finder the whole way, with my stomach somewhere up near my throat. Behind us, one of the pursuing boats slowed hard, clearly uncertain, and the other tried to follow our line and ran hard aground with a sound that carried clear across the water. A grinding, metal-on-sand shriek, followed immediately by shouting. We didn't stop to watch what happened to them. We ran flat out for almost 40 minutes into open water, lights off, until I was confident enough in our lead that I finally cut speed and let everyone breathe. That night, sitting on the deck afterward with the adrenaline slowly draining out of all of us, Harold said something that I've thought about more than almost anything else anyone said to me in that entire first stretch of the apocalypse. He said, "You know the thing about people, Walt, that's worse than those infected sons of bitches? Those things out there, they're honest about what they are. They're never going to pretend to be your friend first." Nobody argued with him. We spent the rest of that week putting more distance between us and that stretch of coast, moving further out, further from any marina or town those particular raiders might have local knowledge of, and I started, for the first time, seriously thinking about what the next stage of this actually needed to look like. Not just surviving raids and scavenging runs, but building genuine, durable self-sufficiency, because I now understood with complete clarity that other people were going to be a permanent and serious threat for as long as this lasted, and as long as this lasted, was starting to look like it might mean the rest of our lives. I'm going to stop the account here for now. At the end of that first stretch, 5 of us on a barge that had stopped feeling like a desperate gamble and started feeling like the only solid ground left in the world. Water under us instead of land, because land had already shown us, in less than 2 months, exactly how fast it could turn on you. After we lost those raiders at the sandbar, we ran for almost 2 days before I let myself feel okay about slowing down again. We ended up in a stretch of open water south of where we'd started, far enough out that the coastline was just a smudge on the horizon most of the time, close enough that we could still reach it for supply runs when we needed to. I picked a holding pattern there, not a fixed spot, because fixed spots get found, but a loose triangle of 3 anchorages I could rotate between depending on weather and how exposed I felt on any given day. This is the part where the barge actually started turning into something. Up to that point, it had been survival in the most basic sense. Keep water in the tanks, keep food in the lockers, keep people from finding us. Now it became building, and building turned out to be its own kind of addiction, in a good way. Every problem solved opened up room for the next one, and for the first time since this all started, I felt like the work was moving forward, instead of just holding a line. The first big push was water independence, because even with the manual RO unit we'd salvaged from the chandlery, we were still spending fuel and risk on supply runs that I wanted to eliminate entirely if I could. Dale and I spent the better part of a week rebuilding the catchment grid across the whole top deck, running gutters along every edge I could angle even slightly, feeding into a manifold that let us direct rainwater either straight to storage or through a sediment filter first, depending on how dirty the first runoff looked. Louisiana coast gets rain often enough that this actually mattered. We weren't relying on it exclusively, but it cut our dependence on the RO unit by more than half within a month, which mattered because that RO unit's filters were a consumable I couldn't make more of once they wore out. Patricia, of all people, turned out to be the one who pushed hardest for growing food rather than just hauling it. She'd grown up on a small farm in Mississippi before nursing school, and she said flat out that canned goods were a countdown clock, not a solution, and that if we didn't start growing something now, we'd be in real trouble in 6 months, regardless of how many scavenging runs we made. I'll be honest, I hadn't thought past supply runs as the long-term food plan, because my background was steel and ballast, not soil. She basically took that project over herself. We built grow beds out of cut-down plastic drums and salvaged lumber, lined them with whatever sheeting we could find to keep saltwater spray off the soil, and Patricia ran an experiment garden of what she figured could survive salt-adjacent conditions. Certain peppers, some hardy greens, herbs that didn't mind a little brackish mist. Half of it failed in the first month. The half that didn't fail became, weirdly, one of the most important psychological things on that boat, because watching something green grow in the middle of all that gray water and gray sky did something for morale that no amount of canned chili ever could. Fuel was the next big problem, and it was the one that scared me most long-term, because diesel doesn't last forever in storage, and there's no way to make more of it once the supply chain that produces it is gone. I started treating fuel like the most precious resource on that barge, more careful with it than food even, because food I could theoretically grow or catch, and diesel I absolutely could not. This is where the marina runs got more serious and more dangerous, because the easy, obvious fuel sources, working fuel docks with intact pumps, had mostly already been hit by other survivors or raiders by the time we went looking. We had to start going further afield, hitting smaller, more obscure spots, private docks behind houses that might have a single tank for a personal boat, abandoned shrimp trawlers with fuel still in their tanks that nobody had thought to siphon yet, marina fuel tanks that looked tapped out on the surface gauge but that I knew, from professional experience, often had several hundred gallons of unusable by gauge but perfectly siphonable fuel sitting below the pickup line. That last trick, draining tanks below the pump's intake level using a hand siphon and a length of hose, became one of our biggest fuel sources over the following 2 months. And it's the kind of detail that I think people who haven't done this kind of work would never think of. Most folks see a gauge reading empty and walk away. I'd spent years dealing with exactly this kind of equipment and knew the gauge was lying. One of these fuel runs is where things went bad in a way that still gives me a cold feeling thinking about it. We'd found a private dock behind what had clearly been a wealthy family's weekend house, a decent-sized cabin cruiser tied up at a private slip with a house tank feeding it that the family had probably used to top off before every trip out. Dale and I went in on the skiff at midday, figuring daylight raids on quiet, isolated spots were actually safer than night runs in some ways, better visibility for us, and the infected seemed slightly less active in full sun, though that's more of a pattern we noticed than something I'd swear was reliable science. The house looked empty, windows dark, no movement, door standing slightly open in a way that made my skin crawl a little, but didn't necessarily mean anything dangerous. Could have just been left that way when the owners fled. We got the siphon hose set up at the dock tank without going near the house itself, which was the plan. Stay at the dock, get the fuel, leave. About 15 minutes into the siphon, working slow because hand siphoning takes time, Dale grabbed my arm and pointed at the house. There was movement in one of the upstairs windows. Not fast movement, just a shape, passing behind the glass, pausing, like it had heard something and was trying to place the sound. We froze completely, hose still running fuel into our containers, both of us watching that window. The shape didn't come to the glass directly. It just kept pacing, back and forth, this slow, repetitive track that I'd already learned to recognize as the kind of restless looping infected sometimes did when they'd heard something but couldn't pin down the direction. We finished the siphon as quietly as we possibly could, capped the containers, and were loading the skiff when the front door of the house banged open, and 3 of them came out at once, fast, in that lurching sprint that always catches you off guard, no matter how many times you've seen it. They must have been clustered together inside, probably drawn to each other through whatever instinct keeps them loosely grouped, and our noise had finally pulled them out altogether. We didn't have time for a controlled retreat. Dale shoved off the dock hard while I was still half stepping into the skiff, and I went into the water up to my knees, scrambled and soaked and cold, and we got maybe 20 feet of clearance before the first one hit the water at the end of the dock, and just kept coming, wading, then swimming in that same uncoordinated, thrashing way we'd first seen that body in the water on night 1. It couldn't catch a moving boat. None of them ever could, not in open water, which is one of the most reliable facts I learned in this whole ordeal. But it kept swimming after us long after any rational creature would have given up. Kept that same wet moaning going the entire time, and watching something that should have drowned just keep grinding forward through the water. No fatigue, no instinct toward self-preservation, is one of those images that doesn't fade, no matter how many times you see its cousins after. We got the fuel back, 40 extra gallons, which mattered enormously at the time. I also got a healthy new respect for never assuming a quiet house meant an empty house. It was around this same stretch, maybe 7 weeks in, that we ran into our first encounter with something that didn't fit neatly into either category. Not infected, not ordinary survivors, just strange, in a way that none of us had a frame for yet. And I want to tell this one carefully, because it stuck with me more than almost anything else from that period. We were running a supply route along a stretch of coast we hadn't worked before, scouting for new marinas, when Harold spotted something through the binoculars that made him go very still and very quiet, which for Harold was unusual. The man had weathered actual hurricanes at sea and didn't rattle easy. It was a shrimp trawler, anchored, lights off, sitting low in the water in a way that suggested either heavy loading or a slow leak. As we got closer, cautious, weapons ready, we could see figures on the deck. 6, maybe 7 of them, standing in a loose arrangement that looked almost ceremonial, all facing the same direction, completely motionless. My first read was that they were infected, somehow gathered together and just frozen in whatever passes for stillness for those things. But infected don't stand in deliberate formation. They don't face a single direction together, unless something specific is drawing all of them at once. And there was nothing visible out there to draw them. We held position at a careful distance and watched for almost 20 minutes. Eventually, one of the figures moved, turned its head, slow, scanning, and Harold, through the binoculars, said in a low voice that it didn't move like the others. Said the head turn was too smooth, too aware. We never got close enough to find out for certain what we were looking at. A larger boat appeared on the horizon not long after, moving fast toward the trawler, and we made the decision to leave, rather than risk getting caught in whatever was happening there. I've turned that scene over in my head more times than I can count since. I don't have an answer for what it was. Maybe a survivor group doing something strange and ritualistic out of stress or grief or fear, holding some kind of vigil, maybe something else. I genuinely don't know, and I've made peace with not knowing, because chasing every strange thing on the water in those early months would have gotten us killed a dozen times over from things that actually mattered more. I bring this up not because I have a tidy explanation, but because it taught me something important about this whole experience. The rules I thought I understood, infected behave this way, survivors behave that way, weren't a complete map. There were always going to be things on the edges that didn't fit, and the only sane response to those things was distance, not curiosity. The storm came in our 9th week, and I want to walk through this one slow, because it's the closest I ever came to losing everything I'd built before the bigger disasters that came later, and because it taught me things about my own design that I genuinely hadn't anticipated, even with all my professional background. I'd been watching the weather build for almost 3 days before it hit, the old-fashioned way, since we had no working forecast service anymore. Just barometric pressure readings off the analog gauge I'd installed early on, cloud patterns, the way the water started moving differently as the pressure dropped. I knew it was coming. I didn't know how bad until the night before it actually arrived, when the pressure dropped faster than anything I'd personally tracked before. Fast enough that even Harold, with decades of sea time, said out loud that this felt like it was shaping up to be a serious one. We didn't have the option of running for a proper harbor, because harbors meant towns, and towns by then meant exactly the kind of risk we'd been avoiding for 2 months. So the decision was to find the most protected natural anchorage we could reach in time and ride it out, which meant working through the night to get into the lee of a string of barrier islands that I hoped would cut enough of the wave action to keep us from getting beaten apart. I spent that entire night running through every stability calculation I knew by heart, factoring in our current loading. We'd added weight since I'd built her, more people, more gear, the grow beds, the expanded solar array, against worst-case wind and wave scenarios. The honest answer that math gave me wasn't comforting. We were carrying more top-heavy structure than I'd originally designed for, and while the hull itself could take serious abuse, the wheelhouse and the connects locker and the solar mounting weren't built for a direct hit from a serious storm. They were built for weather. This wasn't shaping up to be weather. This was shaping up to be something closer to what would have been called, before everything fell apart, a real named storm. I made everyone help me lash down everything that could move, double up every line, and then I did something I'd never done before on that hull. I deliberately took on extra ballast water into compartments I normally kept light, lowering our center of gravity at the cost of freeboard, accepting a riskier margin against waves coming over the deck, in exchange for a much more stable platform against rolling. It was the kind of trade-off you make on paper 100 times in a career, and never actually have to live inside while you're making it. The storm hit just before dawn, and I am not going to pretend I handled the next several hours with any kind of calm professional detachment. I was terrified. We all were. The wind came in screaming, the kind of sound that gets inside your chest and just sits there vibrating. And the barge, built for cargo work, built tough, built by people who knew what the Gulf could do, still groaned in ways that made every weld I'd ever done feel suddenly, horribly uncertain. Dale and I were below at the engine, trying to keep enough power available to adjust our position against the anchor without overworking the motor, while Gary and Harold stayed up top in oilskins, lashed to safety lines, watching for anything coming loose that needed immediate attention. Patricia stayed below with the grow beds covered as best they could be, though we both knew most of that garden wasn't surviving the night regardless of what she did. About 2 hours into the worst of it, one of the solar panel mounts tore loose on the port side, and Gary went out to secure it against my explicit instructions not to leave the safety line zone, because in his words, relayed to me afterward in a furious shouting match, I wasn't going to watch 2 months of work rip off the deck because you were worried about a guy who's been on boats his whole life. He got the mount resecured. He also took a hard fall when a wave broke over the deck unexpectedly, cracked 2 ribs against a stanchion, and spent the rest of that storm in serious pain that Patricia could do almost nothing about, beyond basic wrapping, and what little pain medication we had left. The worst moment of the whole night, for me personally, came around 4 in the morning, when a particularly hard gust hit us broadside, at the same moment as a wave trough, and the whole hull rolled further than anything I'd calculated as safe, in any scenario I'd run. I felt it in my stomach before I felt it anywhere else, that sick lurch of a structure moving past where your instincts say it should stop, and for about 3 full seconds, standing braced in the engine room with my hand locked onto a pipe, I genuinely believed we were going over. We didn't. The added ballast I'd taken on, the thing I'd done out of pure professional instinct rather than any specific calculation I'd had time to fully verify, was very likely the only reason that roll arrested where it did, instead of continuing. I've thought about that moment more than almost any other in this entire account, because it's the closest I've come to understanding, in a visceral rather than theoretical way, what it actually means to bet your life, and the lives of people who trust you on math you did under pressure, with no time to double-check it. By dawn, the worst of it had passed through, leaving behind a gray, churned, exhausted ocean, and a barge that had survived, but didn't come through clean. We'd lost most of Patricia's garden, 1 solar panel entirely, about a third of our rainwater catchment gutter system torn loose, and Gary, with 2 cracked ribs that kept him out of any real physical work for almost 3 weeks. We also gained something from that storm, though we didn't know it yet, and didn't realize how it would tie into everything that came after until much later. The storm pushed a tremendous amount of debris and wreckage along the coast, scattering boats, supplies, and wreckage from places we'd never have found on our own, which meant the weeks immediately after the storm were, despite everything else, some of the best scavenging weeks we had in that whole first stretch. It was during one of those post-storm scavenging runs that I finally got real information about what had happened to Tom. I want to slow down here, because I've put this off twice already in telling this story, and I think that tells you something about how hard it still is. We'd gone in near the outskirts of a small coastal town that had taken a direct hit from the storm, mostly looking for anything useful that might have washed up or been exposed by storm damage. Roofs torn off revealing pantries, that kind of grim opportunity. I wasn't looking for information about my brother. I'd honestly tried, in the weeks since the outbreak started, to keep myself from thinking too hard about what might have happened to him, because there was nothing productive in that kind of thinking, only paralysis. We came across a partially collapsed house, with storm damage exposing the inside of what had clearly been used as some kind of community shelter before it fell, judging by the cots and supplies still scattered through the front rooms. On a wall near the entrance, someone had kept a running list, names and dates, the kind of thing people do when they're trying to track who's still alive in a crisis and who isn't. I almost walked past it. Harold's the one who stopped, read it, and called me over without explaining why. Tom's name was on that list, dated almost 6 weeks earlier. Next to it, in different handwriting, someone had written, "Didn't make it out, Building 4, confirmed." I'm not going to try to describe what that did to me in some poetic way, because it didn't feel poetic. It felt like the floor of my chest dropping away. I'd known, on some level, that the odds of him having survived this long without us ever crossing paths or hearing from him were bad. Knowing it as a vague, bad feeling, and seeing it written on a wall in someone else's handwriting are 2 completely different kinds of knowing. I asked around quietly, in the limited way you can ask around when most of the people who'd know anything are gone or scattered, and eventually pieced together, mostly from Harold, who'd had contact with people from that general area before he ended up alone on that pier where we found him, what had probably happened. The hospital wing Tom had called me about, the one with the lockdown and the strange sounds at night, had been overrun not long after that phone call. Whatever containment they'd attempted had failed, the way every containment attempt seemed to fail in those first weeks, and the building had become one of the worst sites of early spread in that whole area. Tom had stayed on, according to what Harold had heard secondhand, trying to help get patients and staff out, even after it had clearly turned into something beyond saving. Because that's who Tom was. The kind of person who didn't leave a building full of frightened people, even when leaving, was the only smart option left. I don't know exactly how he died. I've decided, somewhere along the way, that I don't actually need to know the specifics, because the specifics wouldn't change anything, except how many more nights I spend lying awake picturing them. What I know is that he stayed to help, and that the world he was trying to help people survive in had already become the kind of world that didn't reward that anymore. I told the others that night, plainly, without trying to dress it up. Patricia put a hand on my shoulder and didn't say anything, which was somehow exactly right. Gary, still wrapped up from his ribs, said quietly that Tom sounded like a good man, and that the good ones dying first was the kind of unfair thing that this whole situation seemed determined to keep proving, over and over. Dale didn't say much. Harold told me, later, alone, that he was sorry he'd been the one to read that wall out loud, and I told him I was glad he had, because not knowing would have been worse, even if knowing hurt more than I expected. I took one day, just one, where I didn't do any work, didn't plan any runs, just sat at the bow of the barge and let myself actually feel it, instead of pushing it down into the engineering problems that had been keeping me upright. Then I got back to work, because that's the only thing I genuinely know how to do with grief that doesn't have anywhere else productive to go. The months that followed that storm and that discovery turned into the real construction phase of what the barge eventually became. And I think grief, weirdly, sharpened my focus on the work rather than dulling it. I threw myself into expanding everything, rebuilding the catchment system better than before, adding a second, smaller skiff we'd salvaged and repaired so we could run 2 scavenging parties independently if needed, building a proper smokehouse out of a salvaged steel drum so Dale and Harold's growing fishing success could actually be preserved long-term instead of eaten immediately or wasted. Fishing, by the way, became one of our most reliable food sources by this point. More reliable, honestly, than scavenging, because the fish didn't run out the way looted shelves did, and because Dale and Harold both had genuine skill with it that grew fast with practice. We ran trot lines off the stern most nights, checked crab traps in shallower water during the day, and Harold taught all of us, eventually, how to read where the fish were likely to be, based on water color, current, and bird activity, which became almost a meditation for me on calmer days, standing at the rail watching the water for the right kind of disturbance. We expanded the solar array to nearly double its original capacity over those months, scavenged from no fewer than 6 different wrecked or abandoned boats, and 1 small coastal solar installation that had apparently been feeding a vacation property before the world ended. Dale rigged a proper charge controller setup that let us run almost everything off solar during daylight and reserve our limited diesel almost entirely for the generator backup and engine movement, which stretched our fuel reserves out far longer than I'd originally projected. We also, during this period, had our worst single encounter with raiders, worse than the sandbar chase, and it's the one that finally taught me, in a way nothing before it had, exactly how far some people were willing to go. It started with a trap, and I should have seen it coming, because in hindsight the signs were almost too obvious. We picked up a distress signal, an actual radio call, on an old marine channel I still monitored out of habit, a woman's voice, frightened, saying she was alone on a disabled boat with a sick child, giving coordinates, asking for any help at all. I almost ran for it immediately. Patricia's instinct, the same instinct that had been right about Harold, told her this one felt wrong, too clean, too perfectly designed to pull at exactly the kind of sympathy that had worked on us before. I argued that we couldn't assume every distress call was a trap just because we'd gotten burned once by raiders using different tactics. Harold, surprisingly, sided with caution, said something that stuck with me since. Best traps don't look like traps, Walt. They look exactly like the thing you can't say no to. We compromised. I agreed to investigate from a distance rather than running straight in, approaching slow, scanning with binoculars from outside, what I judged to be effective ambush range, before committing any closer. It's the only reason what happened next didn't end far worse than it did. The boat at the coordinates was real, disabled, drifting. There was no woman visible on deck, no child. As we held position scanning, 2 other boats came around a point of land fast, converging on the disabled boat's position from 2 different directions, clearly intending to box in whatever responded to that distress call. We turned and ran immediately, and this time the chase lasted most of an hour, longer and more sustained than anything before, both pursuing boats faster than ours, and clearly more aggressive about closing the gap, firing warning shots at one point that hit close enough to the water near our stern that Gary, fully healed from his ribs by then, returned fire without waiting for my order, which I didn't fault him for given the circumstances. We escaped that one through pure local knowledge rather than speed, running into a stretch of shallow flats that I knew from years of professional charting work in that area. Flats that looked open and inviting on the surface, but that hid sandbars I could navigate from memory, and pursuing strangers almost certainly couldn't. One of the boats ran hard aground again. The second one slowed dramatically, trying to avoid the same fate, and we used that gap to put real distance between us before full dark. That encounter changed how I thought about distress calls permanently, and changed how I thought about other survivors in general. Not into pure cynicism. Harold and Patricia and Dale and Gary had all come to us in moments that could have been read as suspicious, and all 4 of them had turned out to be exactly who they claimed to be. But it taught me that good faith had to be earned through demonstrated behavior over time, never assumed up front just because someone sounded desperate, because desperation was the easiest performance in the world to fake when there was something valuable enough on the other end of it. It was maybe 4 months in, after we'd weathered all of this. The storm, the trap, Tom's loss, the slow grinding accumulation of supplies and skill and hard-won caution, that we started hearing rumors, secondhand, filtered through occasional radio chatter. We picked up monitoring open channels, about something bigger, operating further down the coast. Not raiders, something organized differently. People talked about it in fragments, half confirmed. The kind of thing that spreads on survivor radio, the way ghost stories spread around a campfire. A fleet, multiple vessels working together, defended territory, actual trade happening between boats instead of just raiding. I didn't take it seriously at first. We'd survived this long by trusting almost nothing we hadn't verified directly. And a rumor about an organized fleet sounded, frankly, like exactly the kind of story raiders might spread to lure cautious survivors into the open. But the rumor kept coming back, from different channels, different voices, with enough consistent detail across unrelated sources that I started to think there might actually be something real behind it. Harold, who'd spent more time than any of us listening to the open channels out of old habit from his tugboat days, was the one who first picked up something concrete. A recurring signal, on a schedule, broadcasting what sounded like a structured check-in protocol rather than random chatter. Vessel call signs, brief status updates, nothing that gave away location specifics, but unmistakably the sound of an actual organization, with actual rules, not chaos. That changed the calculus for me. Chaos, I understood by then. Chaos I knew how to survive against. An organized group, with rules, with structure, with apparently enough stability to run scheduled radio check-ins 4 months into the end of the world. That was something different. And I genuinely didn't know yet whether it represented the best opportunity we'd find or the most dangerous threat we hadn't yet faced. I made the decision, after a long, careful conversation with all 5 of us sitting together on the deck one evening, with the last of the daylight going orange and gray across the water, that we'd investigate, cautiously, the same way we'd investigated everything else that mattered, slow, from distance, never committing further than we could safely retreat from. Patricia asked the question that mattered most before we agreed on anything. If we find them, and they're real, and they're as organized as this radio chatter suggests, what do we actually want from them? Alliance? Trade? Or just information, and then distance? I didn't have a clean answer for her that night. What I had was 5 months of hard lessons, telling me that every new contact with other humans had, so far, either nearly gotten us killed, or, in the case of the 4 people now living and working on that barge with me, turned out to be the best decisions I'd made in this entire ordeal. I genuinely didn't know which category this fleet, if it existed at all, was going to fall into. What I did know, sitting there that evening with the barge swinging gently at anchor, lights dim, everyone's faces tired in the way that comes from real work rather than just survival, was that the structure I'd built, physically, and in the people now standing on its deck, was strong enough by then to risk finding out. We started planning the approach the next morning. None of us knew yet how deep that decision was about to take us, or how much it would test every single thing we'd built and learned in those first 4 months. That part of the story, the fleet, what we found when we finally got close enough to see it clearly, and what it cost us to find out whether they could be trusted. That's where I need to pick this up next, because trying to tell it as part of this stretch would do it a disservice. Some things need their own room to breathe, and this is one of them. The fleet, when we finally found it, looked nothing like what any of the rumors had described, and that mismatch is honestly the first thing that should have warned me something about this situation wasn't simple. We'd spent almost 2 weeks closing in on it carefully, following radio discipline, triangulating roughly where those scheduled check-ins seemed to be originating from, based on signal strength at different positions along the coast. Dale was good at this part, better than I expected. Turned out years of running boats meant he understood radio propagation in a practical, hands-on way that complemented whatever I half remembered from engineering school. By the second week we had a rough sense of a working area, a stretch of open water maybe 40 miles offshore, far enough out that almost nobody, without serious fuel reserves and serious nerve, would bother going there. When we finally got close enough to see them with our own eyes, It wasn't one fortress floating on the water, like I'd half pictured in my head. It was a cluster. 11 vessels that I could count from a distance, ranging from a converted offshore supply ship that looked like it could have come straight out of my old job, down to smaller fishing boats, and at least 2 sailing yachts that had clearly been retrofitted for something other than recreation. They were arranged in a loose defensive ring, with smaller boats running patrol routes between the larger anchored vessels, and even from 2 miles out through binoculars, I could tell this wasn't improvised. This was planned, practiced, maintained. We held at distance for the better part of a day, watching, the same patient approach that had kept us alive this long. Patricia counted people moving on the decks of the larger ships, said the numbers she was seeing suggested something close to 200 people total, maybe more, which was a scale of organized survival I genuinely hadn't believed was possible 4 months into this thing. A patrol boat found us before we found a way to approach on our own terms, and I want to be honest, that first contact put my heart somewhere up near my throat, in a way it hadn't been since the night we ran the sandbar. It came at us fast. 2 figures visible at the rail, weapons held but not raised, which I read, correctly as it turned out, as a deliberate signal rather than an oversight. A woman's voice came across on a hailing channel, calm, professional, asking us to identify ourselves, state our business, and hold position. Not threatening, procedural. Like a Coast Guard stop from before everything fell apart. Except everyone on both sides understood there was no Coast Guard left to enforce anything, which made the calm somehow stranger and more impressive than if they'd come in screaming. I identified myself, said we were 5 survivors, unaffiliated, that we'd heard their radio traffic and wanted to know if contact was possible, that we weren't looking for trouble. There was a pause on the line, long enough that I assumed someone was relaying that information up a chain of command I didn't know existed yet, and then the voice came back and told us to hold our current heading, that an escort would bring us in if we agreed to be boarded and checked first. Checked for what? I asked. Sickness, the voice said. Simple as that. We don't let anyone aboard our perimeter without a check first. You'll understand why if you've made it this far. I did understand, immediately and completely, because it was exactly the kind of precaution I would have implemented myself if I'd had the manpower to enforce it. I agreed. The check turned out to be more sophisticated than I expected. Not just a visual look for bites or fever, though that was part of it, but a series of questions asked by someone who I'd guess had medical training. The kind of careful, layered questioning designed to catch inconsistencies in a story, rather than just take someone's word for their own health. Patricia, predictably, hit it off immediately with the man running our check, a former physician's assistant named Donald Pruitt, who ran what amounted to a quarantine protocol for the whole fleet, and the 2 of them spent almost 20 minutes talking shop in a way that put me, oddly, more at ease than anything else about that whole encounter. People who took medical rigor that seriously, even now, with no governing body forcing them to, weren't running a chaotic operation. Once we cleared the check, they brought us into the actual anchorage, and seeing it up close only reinforced how much more developed this fleet was than what we'd built. They had a working desalination setup bigger than anything I could have assembled, run off a dedicated generator system that someone had clearly thought through with real engineering knowledge. They had a fish processing operation running off the stern of one of the larger boats, smoking and drying catch at a scale that suggested feeding 200 people wasn't a daily crisis, the way it sometimes still felt for us feeding 5. They even had what looked like a school operation running on the deck of one of the smaller boats, a handful of children sitting cross-legged, while an older woman read to them from a book, which hit me harder emotionally than almost anything else I saw that day. Because somewhere in the last 4 months, I'd stopped letting myself picture a future that had children doing ordinary things, like sitting still and listening to a story. The man in charge of the fleet, or at least the man everyone deferred to in conversation, was named Russell Tate. He'd been, before all this, a regional logistics manager for a shipping company, which honestly made an enormous amount of sense once I learned it, because everything about how that fleet operated had the fingerprints of someone who understood supply chains, redundancy, and contingency planning at an institutional level, rather than the scrappy, improvised level I'd been operating at with 5 people and my own engineering background. Russell met with me personally, which I took, correctly, as a sign that they were taking our arrival seriously rather than treating us as a minor curiosity. He was maybe 50, calm in the specific way of someone who'd had to make a lot of hard calls already and had settled into the weight of that, rather than being crushed by it. He asked good questions, not about our supplies first, which surprised me, but about how we'd survived, what threats we'd encountered, what we'd learned about the infected's behavior patterns, almost like he was running a debrief rather than a negotiation. I gave him an honest accounting, the same way I've tried to give one here. The barge, the build, the storm, the raiders, the strange standing figures on that trawler. We never investigated further. The radio trap that nearly got us boxed in. He listened without interrupting, occasionally asking a clarifying question, and when I finished, he sat quiet for a moment, before saying something that I think genuinely shifted how I understood our position in this larger world, for the first time since the outbreak started. He said, "You built something stable with 5 people and almost no outside help. That's rarer than you probably realize. Most of what's joined us has been broken people. We had to rebuild from nothing. You came to us already standing." That should have felt like a compliment, and on the surface it was one, but something about the way he said it stuck in my head afterward in a way I couldn't immediately place. I'm an engineer. I notice load-bearing assumptions even in conversation, the things a statement is quietly resting its weight on without saying so directly. And what that statement was resting on, I realized later, was an assumption that we were now, simply by virtue of having made contact, something he was already counting as part of his fleet's resources. We spent 3 days anchored alongside them before I made any decisions, watching, talking, letting the others form their own impressions independently, rather than just relying on mine. Gary spent most of that time talking with their security detail, a loose but disciplined group running armed patrol rotations, and came back impressed, said they ran tighter discipline than half the actual military units he'd grown up around family members in. Dale spent his time in their engineering spaces, trading knowledge about solar setups and water systems, came back genuinely excited in a way I hadn't seen from him in months, talking about ideas he wanted to bring back to our own barge. Harold predictably gravitated toward their senior captains, swapping sea stories, gathering the kind of informal intelligence that comes from old men talking shop, rather than formal briefings. Patricia spent almost all 3 days in their medical operation, and came back to me on the second night, looking troubled, in a way I hadn't seen from her since the night we found Tom's name on that wall. She told me, quietly, away from the others, that something about their medical operation didn't add up. Not the equipment, not the protocols, which she actually praised as more thorough than anything we'd managed on our own. It was the numbers. She'd overheard, not eavesdropped exactly, just been present for conversations not meant to be hidden from her specifically. References to a secondary quarantine that wasn't the one we'd gone through, a separate space, restricted, that even some of the fleet's own people seemed uneasy talking about directly. I asked her straight if she thought they were hiding infected people somewhere, which was the most obvious dark explanation, and she said she genuinely didn't know, but that something about the way people changed the subject when it came up reminded her of how hospital staff used to talk around a diagnosis they didn't want to give a family directly. Not lying exactly, managing information, which in her professional experience, she said, usually meant there was something specific they were protecting people from knowing, not necessarily something monstrous, but something they'd decided wasn't ready to be common knowledge yet. That conversation changed the shape of my thinking about the alliance question entirely. Up to that point, I'd been weighing it mostly in terms of resources and security. Did joining a larger group make us stronger, or did it expose us to risks of dependency and politics we hadn't had to deal with when it was just the 5 of us making every decision together? Now there was a third variable. Something was being hidden, and I had no way yet of knowing whether that something was dangerous to us specifically or just an internal matter that had nothing to do with our decision at all. I brought it to Russell directly on the 3rd day, because I'd decided, fairly early in this whole experience, that the only way to actually build trust with anyone was to test it openly, rather than try to quietly investigate behind their back, which I figured would either get caught and destroy whatever trust we'd built so far, or succeed and leave me knowing something true but having gained it dishonestly, which felt like its own kind of corrosive start to a relationship that might end up mattering for the rest of our lives. Russell didn't deny it when I asked him plainly what the secondary quarantine was. He looked at me for a long moment, the kind of look I recognized from negotiating contracts back when contracts were still a thing people negotiated, weighing how much truth the relationship could bear at this stage. And then he told me. There was a separate group aboard, he said, survivors they'd rescued early on, about 3 weeks into the outbreak, from a research facility that had been doing work related to the outbreak before it collapsed entirely. He didn't claim to fully understand the science himself, said most of what he knew came secondhand from the 2 surviving researchers among that group. But the broad shape of it was this. The outbreak hadn't started as a single clean event everyone could point to and say that's day 1. There'd been research happening, government adjacent, into whatever pathogen or condition was behind all this. Research that had apparently been ongoing for some time before public collapse, possibly because whoever was running it already suspected what was coming and was trying to find a way to stop or contain it before it spread fully. The facility had been overrun in the early chaos, like almost everything else, but a small group, including these 2 researchers, had escaped with some records and, according to Russell, partial samples and notes that they'd been extremely cautious about even discussing openly, both because the information was disturbing and because they didn't fully trust how people would react to learning that this whole catastrophe might have been, even partially, something humans had a hand in, either causing or failing to contain in time. I asked him directly if he believed it was engineered, man-made, something worse than a naturally occurring outbreak that just got out of hand. He said he honestly didn't know, that the researchers themselves seemed uncertain or unwilling to say definitively, but that what mattered practically, in his view, was less the origin and more the fact that these 2 people seemed to understand more about how the infection behaved than anyone else he'd encountered, and that understanding had genuinely saved lives within the fleet on at least 2 occasions when outbreaks had started among their own population from bite injuries that weren't disclosed in time. That last detail hit me harder than anything else in that conversation. Outbreaks within the fleet itself. I asked how that had been handled, and Russell's expression shifted into something more guarded, more careful, and he said only that it had been handled, that it had cost lives, and that the secondary quarantine existed specifically because of lessons learned from those incidents. Not to hide infected people indefinitely among the healthy population, but to give any potential exposure case a strict, monitored isolation period before being cleared, run with much stricter protocols than our own initial boarding check had used. I respected the honesty of that answer more than I expected to, even though it raised at least as many questions as it answered. I told him I needed time to think about what an actual alliance would look like, what it would require from us, what it would offer in return, and what kind of independence we'd retain versus what we'd be folding into his structure. He said that was fair, that he wasn't interested in pressuring anyone into a decision that mattered this much, and that the offer would remain open whether we decided in a week or a month. I want to be honest about the internal debate that followed over the next several days back aboard our own barge, because it wasn't a clean, unified decision. Gary was the most enthusiastic about joining fully, citing the security and discipline of their patrol structure as exactly the kind of protection we couldn't replicate with 5 people no matter how good we got. Dale was excited about the technical exchange possibilities, but worried, in his quieter way, about losing the independence that had let us make fast, unilateral decisions in moments where hesitation could have killed us. The sandbar run, the storm ballast call, decisions that worked specifically because I hadn't needed to consult a committee first. Harold was the most skeptical of full integration, said in his experience any organization that large, however well run, eventually develops internal politics that outlast the original good intentions of the people who built it, and that he'd rather we maintain enough independence to walk away cleanly if that ever happened. Patricia's position was the most nuanced, and probably the one that ended up shaping my final decision most directly. She said the medical knowledge those researchers held was potentially too valuable to walk away from entirely, given what we'd already seen happen with infected bites and the speed at which conversion could occur. But that didn't mean we had to surrender our entire independence to get access to it. Trade relationship, she suggested. Mutual aid, not absorption. I went back to Russell with exactly that proposal after about 10 days of back and forth among ourselves. A formal alliance, mutual defense commitments, information and resource sharing, including access to whatever medical knowledge his researchers were willing to share about infection behavior and risk assessment, but with our barge remaining operationally independent, making our own decisions about where to anchor, what runs to make, who to take in, with the alliance functioning more like a treaty between two sovereign groups than an absorption of the smaller into the larger. Russell pushed back on some of it, understandably, since full independence cuts against the coordinated defense logic that made his fleet effective in the first place. But we eventually landed on a working compromise, shared communication protocols, an agreed mutual defense response if either group came under serious threat within a certain radius, regular but not constant rendezvous points for trade and information exchange, and crucially, an agreement that we'd be informed promptly of anything discovered about the infection that had direct survival implications for us, in exchange for sharing whatever scavenging intelligence and technical knowledge we developed independently. It felt, honestly, like the most adult decision I'd made in this entire process, the first one that wasn't purely reactive to an immediate threat. And for about 6 weeks after we signed onto that arrangement, things actually went better than I'd let myself hope they could. We traded engineering knowledge for medical protocols, learned a lot from Donald Pruitt and Patricia's growing relationship with him about early signs of infection that weren't obvious to an untrained eye, things that ended up mattering enormously later. We got access, through the fleet's larger scavenging operation, to supply caches and salvage sites that a 5-person crew working alone never could have reached safely. In return, Dale's solar and water knowledge actually improved efficiency on 2 of their smaller vessels, and my structural assessment skills got used to evaluate and reinforce 2 boats in their fleet that had developed worrying stress patterns nobody aboard had the background to properly diagnose. I met the 2 researchers eventually, briefly, in a closely monitored setting that Russell arranged once enough trust had built between us. A woman named Eleanor Voss and a man named Reginald Okafor, both clearly carrying a weight that went beyond ordinary survival stress, the specific kind of exhaustion that comes from knowing things other people don't, and having to decide, every day, how much of that knowledge is safe or useful to share. They were careful, guarded, but not hostile, and the little they told me directly, mostly technical detail about infection vectors, about how the pathogen seemed to spread through bodily fluid contact specifically, and didn't appear to be airborne the way some of the wildest early rumors had claimed, matched everything we'd already independently learned through hard, dangerous experience, which gave me more confidence in their honesty than any reassurance from Russell alone could have. I'm telling you all this in some detail because I think it matters for understanding what happened next, and because I genuinely believed, for those 6 weeks, that we'd found something close to a sustainable, cooperative future. I want that belief on the record, because what came after didn't erase the fact that it had been real and good while it lasted. The betrayal, when it came, didn't come from Russell directly, and I want to be precise about that, because it's easy in hindsight to collapse a complicated situation into a simple villain, and that's not honestly what happened. It came from a faction within the fleet that had apparently been growing for some time without my full awareness. A group led by a man named Curtis Halloway, who ran what amounted to the fleet's largest defensive vessel, that converted offshore supply ship I'd noticed on our first approach. Curtis, I learned later from Harold, who'd developed enough rapport with some of the senior captains to hear things through informal channels, had never trusted Russell's relatively open, trade-based approach to integrating new groups, and had been quietly building support for a harder, more controlling philosophy, that newcomers should be fully absorbed, their resources pooled directly under centralized fleet control, with no independent decision-making capacity left outside the fleet's command structure. He saw our arrangement specifically, the independent alliance Russell had agreed to with us, as a dangerous precedent that weakened the overall coherence and security of the fleet. And apparently, he'd argued that position internally more than once, without success in changing Russell's mind. What Curtis did instead, about 6 weeks into our alliance, was act unilaterally, attempting to force the situation by sending 2 of his crew aboard our barge under the pretense of a routine trade exchange, with quiet instructions, we learned afterward, to assess our defenses and supplies directly, information that I have to assume he intended to use to make a forceful case, either to Russell or potentially around Russell entirely, for absorbing us by other means if persuasion through the official channel kept failing. We caught it almost by accident, through Dale, who'd developed a genuinely good working relationship with several of the fleet's engineers, and happened to overhear, in passing, one of Curtis's crew mentioning something about taking stock before the next move, in a tone that didn't match a routine trade visit at all. Dale brought it to me immediately, and I brought it directly to Russell rather than confronting Curtis's people aboard our own barge, because I judged, correctly as it turned out, that an internal fleet political problem needed to be solved internally, rather than risking an armed standoff that could have fractured the entire alliance violently. Russell's reaction, to his credit, was immediate and decisive. He confronted Curtis directly, in front of enough witnesses that it became impossible to deny or downplay afterward, and made it absolutely clear that unilateral action against an allied group, especially action involving deception and unauthorized intelligence gathering, was a direct violation of fleet command structure that he would not tolerate, regardless of how strongly Curtis disagreed with the underlying policy. It didn't resolve cleanly. Curtis backed down publicly, but the tension didn't disappear, and over the following 2 weeks I watched, with growing unease, as a visible fault line developed within the fleet itself. Not yet violent, but cold, political. The kind of internal fracture that I recognized, even without much organizational experience of my own, as the sort of thing that eventually either heals through genuine resolution or festers until it breaks something important. I had a hard conversation with Russell about it directly, told him plainly that I respected what he'd built and appreciated his handling of the situation, but that I needed him to understand we couldn't risk our people's safety on the assumption that internal fleet politics would resolve favorably before something worse happened. He didn't argue with that, said he understood completely, and that he was already working on a longer-term solution that would either bring Curtis fully back in line or separate his faction from the fleet's core leadership structure entirely, because he wasn't willing to let one man's distrust of outside cooperation put everyone else's security at risk. I appreciated his honesty, but I also made the call, after talking it through carefully with all 5 of us back aboard our own deck, to quietly increase our operational distance from the fleet's main anchorage, while that internal situation worked itself out, maintaining the alliance and communication protocols but pulling our own physical position further out, reducing our exposure to whatever might happen if Curtis decided to act again, more decisively, the next time. That decision turned out to be one of the most important I made in this entire account, though not for the reason I expected when I made it. About 3 weeks after we pulled back to a more cautious distance, the storm hit. Not a storm like the one we'd weathered alone months earlier. This one was bigger, slower, and it pushed something ahead of it that none of us, not me, not Russell, not anyone in either group, had fully anticipated, even with everything we'd already learned about how this new world worked. I'd been tracking the pressure drop for almost 4 days before it became clear this storm was going to be serious, working off the same analog instruments I'd relied on before, supplemented now by occasional information shared through the fleet's slightly better equipped weather tracking, since one of their boats had a working barometric recorder more sophisticated than mine. The early read from their meteorologically inclined crew member, a former commercial pilot named Gerald Lindquist, who'd taken on weather forecasting almost as a personal mission within the fleet, was that this storm was tracking toward making landfall somewhere along a stretch of coast that had, over the preceding months, become one of the densest concentrations of infected activity that either group had observed. I didn't immediately understand why that mattered, beyond the obvious danger of a major storm. Gerald's theory, which he explained to Russell, and which Russell relayed to me during one of our communication windows, was something none of us had considered before. Storm surge and flooding along a coastline with that density of infected activity could potentially push enormous numbers of them off the land entirely, not by any decision or intent on their part, since they couldn't reason or plan, but simply through the same blind, mindless persistence that kept them moving toward any stimulus regardless of physical obstacles. If a storm surge flooded low-lying areas where large numbers had been clustering, possibly drawn there by sound or scent concentration over months, the water itself could become the path of least resistance carrying them outward, the same way debris gets carried by a flood, except this debris would still be capable of grabbing onto anything it reached. It sounded almost too strange to be a real threat at first, the idea of a wave of infected being pushed out to sea by weather, rather than any decision of their own. But Harold, with his decades of hurricane experience, said quietly that he'd seen storm surge move things you wouldn't believe possible, entire structures, vehicles, and that there was no reason floating, mindless bodies would behave any differently from any other debris caught in that kind of water. We spent the 3 days before the storm's arrival in the most intense preparation work of the entire ordeal, coordinating as tightly with the fleet as our alliance structure allowed, even with the lingering tension from the Curtis situation still simmering somewhere in the background. Russell, to his credit, set that political conflict aside almost entirely once the storm threat became clear, focusing every available resource on defensive preparation rather than internal disputes, which told me something important about his priorities when it actually mattered. We reinforced everything on our own barge that the first storm had taught us was vulnerable. Better solar mount bracing this time, a fully redesigned catchment system that could be rapidly secured rather than torn loose, and crucially, a complete review of our perimeter defenses against the specific possibility of infected actually reaching the hull in numbers, rather than the occasional single body we'd dealt with before. I redesigned, in those frantic 3 days, a boarding net and spike rail system along our lowest freeboard sections, simple but effective, angled steel that would make it nearly impossible for anything climbing blindly to get purchase, welded in place by Dale and me working in shifts almost without sleep. The fleet did similar work at a larger scale, reinforcing their own perimeter vessels, distributing additional weapons and ammunition to every boat capable of holding a defensive line, and crucially, moving their most vulnerable population, children, the injured, the elderly, onto the vessels positioned furthest from where Gerald's storm tracking suggested the worst surge and infected displacement would hit. I made the decision, with full agreement from everyone aboard our own barge, to position ourselves close enough to the fleet's defensive perimeter to provide and receive mutual support if the worst case materialized, accepting the political discomfort of proximity to Curtis's faction, because the alternative, facing whatever was coming completely alone with 5 people, was a risk I wasn't willing to take regardless of how I felt about fleet internal politics. The storm arrived at night, which by now felt like some kind of grim pattern I'd stopped being surprised by. The wind and rain were bad, genuinely bad, worse in raw intensity than the storm we'd weathered alone months earlier. But we'd learned enough by then, and reinforced enough, that the structural fight against the weather itself, while terrifying, felt more manageable than it had the first time. I trusted my ballast calculations this time because I'd actually had proper time to verify them rather than improvising under pressure, and that trust mattered enormously for keeping a clear head through the worst of the wind. The real horror started a few hours after the storm's peak intensity, when the surge had pushed far enough inland to do exactly what Gerald had predicted, and word came across the radio, fractured and urgent, from one of the fleet's outermost picket boats, that there were bodies in the water. Not 1 or 2, a field of them, stretching as far as the picket boat's spotlight could illuminate through the rain, moving with the current and the wind-driven waves, limbs occasionally thrashing in that same uncoordinated, undrowning way we'd seen from individual infected in water before, except now multiplied into something that looked, in the chaotic sweep of that spotlight, like the surface of the ocean itself had come alive and turned hostile. I want to try to convey what it actually felt like standing on that deck as that mass came into view over the following hour, because no description fully captures it, but I'll try. It wasn't like watching an enemy advance with intent, because there was no intent there, no strategy, nothing to read or anticipate beyond the certainty that anything that mass touched, it would try to climb onto, to bite, to drag down, with the same blind persistence we'd already learned, defined every single one of them individually. Except now there were what looked like hundreds, possibly more, all moving with the storm-driven current toward the fleet's position, because that's simply the direction the water was carrying them. Russell's voice came across the radio, steady despite everything, giving coordinated instructions to every vessel in the fleet, establishing fire discipline, designating which boats would hold the outer perimeter and which would protect the inner core, where the most vulnerable people were sheltered. I matched our own defensive posture to his coordination as closely as our independent positioning allowed, putting Gary and Harold on our spike rail line with every weapon we had, Dale running the engine ready to adjust our position if the current pushed the mast toward us directly, Patricia below with the medical kit fully prepared, and me moving between every station doing whatever needed doing in the moment, which on a night like that meant constantly recalculating, in my head, exactly how much pressure our perimeter defenses could actually withstand if that floating mass converged on us in numbers, rather than passing by in the current. The first real contact came when a cluster of maybe a dozen of them, carried by an eddy in the current, drifted directly into our spike rail line along the port side. The sound of that contact is something I will never be able to fully describe to anyone who wasn't there. Not screaming exactly, more like a chorus of that same wet, grinding moan we'd learned to recognize from individuals, except layered a dozen times over, mixed with the metal-on-flesh sound of bodies hitting the angled spikes and failing, over and over, to find purchase, that mindless, repetitive failure that should have been almost comic in its futility, except that every single body in that cluster kept trying anyway, with zero capacity to learn from the ones that had already failed beside them. Gary and Harold worked that line for what felt like hours, but was probably closer to 40 minutes, using long gaff hooks and a couple of improvised spears we'd built specifically for situations like this, pushing bodies off before they could accumulate enough mass against the rail to potentially overwhelm the spikes through sheer numbers and weight, rather than any individual capability. I remember the specific sick sound of Harold's gaff connecting with something that had once been a person, the grunt of effort, the brief pause before he reset and did it again, his face in the stormlight absolutely focused, no hesitation left in him after everything we'd already survived together. At one point, a body got enough purchase on a section of rail that had taken minor storm damage during the first hour, started pulling itself up despite the spikes, jaw working in that horrible silent persistence, and Dale, who'd come up from the engine room to help, when our position stabilized enough that the engine didn't need constant attention, took it down with a length of rebar we'd welded a handle onto specifically for this kind of close work, swinging with a controlled, economical motion that told me everything about how much he'd grown from the shaking, traumatized kid who'd killed his first infected at that fuel dock months earlier. I lost track of time during the worst of it, in a way I genuinely never had before, even during the first storm. There was no room in my head for anything except the immediate threat in front of whichever station I was at, and the constant, grinding mental math of structural integrity, ammunition remaining, and how much longer any of us could keep this pace up before exhaustion became as dangerous as the bodies in the water. Word came over the radio, fragmented through the storm interference, that one of the fleet's smaller vessels had been overrun on its outer perimeter, that the crew had been forced to abandon it and consolidate onto a larger boat, that there were confirmed losses but the situation was being contained. I didn't know, in that moment, who those losses were, and I want to be honest, that there was a selfish, narrow part of my brain that was almost relieved it wasn't immediately confirmed as anyone I knew personally, even while another part of me felt sick at having that thought at all, in the middle of people actually dying somewhere out there in the dark. The mass of infected in the water didn't behave like a coordinated assault, because it couldn't. But it had its own terrible logic that worked against us anyway. The storm-driven current kept pushing fresh waves of them toward the fleet's position for hours, not because anything was directing them there, simply because that's where the water was carrying everything caught in it, debris and bodies alike, and the fleet's defensive line had to hold not against one wave but against what felt like an endless, randomly timed series of them, with no way to know when it would finally taper off. It was sometime past 3 in the morning, by Dale's later reconstruction from the engine logs, that the worst of the human cost on our own barge happened. And I need to tell this part as plainly as I can, because dressing it up wouldn't be honest to what it actually felt like. Gary had been working the port rail continuously for almost 2 hours by that point, exhausted in a way that even his stubborn refusal to admit weakness couldn't fully hide anymore, when a particularly large surge of current brought what I estimate, looking back at it, was close to 20 bodies into contact with our line all at once, far more than the steady trickle we'd been managing up to that point. The spike rail held against most of them, but the sheer mass and weight pressing against one section that had already taken storm damage earlier in the night finally gave way, a length of railing tearing partially free under the combined weight, and 3 of them got enough purchase in that gap to start pulling themselves aboard. I was at the other end of the deck when it happened, helping Harold manage a separate cluster, and by the time I registered the shouting and turned, Gary was already engaged with the first one through the gap, and Dale was moving fast to close the second flank, and for about 10 seconds, that felt like an hour, I genuinely didn't know if we were about to lose the whole deck. We didn't. Gary dropped the first one with brutal economical violence that told me, even in the chaos, how much this man had changed from the welder who'd shown up on the dock that first day with 2 duffel bags and an apologetic look on his face. Dale and I together managed the second and third, working in a coordination we'd never explicitly practiced, but that months of living and working together had apparently built into something close to instinct. The cost was that Gary took a bite, low on his left forearm, in the brief chaotic struggle before he finished off the first one through the gap. I need to slow down here, because this is the part of the story that I think tests everything we'd built more than the storm itself ever could. We got him below immediately, into Patricia's medical station, and I watched her face in the lantern light as she examined that wound, looking for whatever signs she and Donald Pruitt had discussed during our weeks of alliance with the fleet, the early indicators that distinguished a survivable bite from something that had already crossed past any hope of intervention. She worked fast, focused, cleaning and assessing, with a steadiness that I don't think I could have managed if our positions had been reversed. What she told us, after several agonizing minutes, was something none of us had heard before with any confidence. Something that had apparently come directly from Eleanor and Reginald's research, shared with her during one of her conversations with Donald. The infection's progression wasn't instant, and it wasn't uniform. It depended on the severity of the wound, the amount of viral load transferred, and crucially, on how quickly the wound was treated. A deep, severe bite, with significant fluid exposure and delayed treatment, converted almost universally within hours, which matched everything we'd already assumed from earlier, grimmer experiences. But a shallower bite, treated immediately with aggressive wound cleaning and a specific antiviral protocol the researchers had developed from captured samples, had, in a small but real number of documented cases within the fleet, failed to progress to full conversion at all. It wasn't a guaranteed cure. Patricia was completely honest about that, even as she worked, even as Gary sat there pale and silent, and clearly terrified in a way I'd genuinely never seen from him before. Not during raids, not during the first storm, not during anything else we'd been through together. She told him straight, "This gives you a chance, not a promise, and the next several hours are going to be the hardest thing either of us has had to do together." We didn't have the specific antiviral compound the researchers had developed. We had what Patricia had managed to learn and replicate in limited supply from earlier exchanges, a combination of aggressive cleaning, a course of broad antimicrobials we already carried, and something Donald had given her weeks earlier almost as an afterthought, a small reserve of an experimental compound that Eleanor's team had synthesized from whatever they'd salvaged from their original research facility, intended specifically for exactly this kind of emergency. We used it. There wasn't a debate about it, not really, even though using it meant relying on knowledge and material we'd only recently, cautiously, started trusting from an alliance that had nearly fractured under us just weeks earlier because of Curtis's faction. I'm not going to pretend the next several hours were anything but agonizing. Gary's fever spiked hard within 2 hours, and there was a stretch, somewhere past 4 in the morning, with the storm still raging outside, and the fleet's radio chatter still reporting ongoing contact along their own perimeter, where I genuinely believed we were watching him die, or worse, watching him begin to turn into the thing we'd just spent the whole night fighting off. Patricia stayed with him the entire time, monitoring everything she could monitor with the limited equipment we had, talking to him in this low, steady voice that I think mattered as much for keeping him anchored to himself as any of the medicine did. Harold took over Gary's defensive position without being asked. Dale split his time between the engine and helping wherever else he could. I kept moving between every station on that deck, doing the work of trying to hold everything together physically, while my chest felt like it was caving in over the possibility of losing someone who'd become, over 4.5 months, something closer to family than I think any of us had let ourselves fully admit out loud. The storm itself finally began breaking by dawn, the wind dropping, the rain thinning from a sheet into something closer to ordinary heavy weather, and the flood of infected in the water thinning along with it as the surge began to recede, and whatever current had been carrying them outward shifted with the changing tide. Russell's voice came across the radio as the light came up, exhausted but steady, confirming that the fleet's perimeter had held overall, with losses, real losses, that he didn't detail over open radio, but that I could hear weighing in the careful pauses of how he spoke. Gary's fever broke around 7 in the morning, 3 hours after we'd started genuinely fearing the worst. Patricia checked him over for almost 20 minutes in complete silence, before finally sitting back, exhaling something that sounded like it had been held in her chest for the entire night, and telling the rest of us, in a voice that was trying very hard to stay professional and clinical, and failing in the best possible way, that the wound site showed no sign of progression, that his fever pattern matched ordinary infection response rather than anything she recognized from what little documented progression data the researchers had shared with her, and that as far as she could tell, against odds none of us had wanted to say out loud, he was going to be okay. I'm not a man who cries easily, and I'm not going to pretend I handled that news with any particular grace. I sat down hard on the deck, right where I was standing, and just put my face in my hands for a minute, and nobody said anything about it, because I think every single person on that boat needed that same minute and just expressed it differently. The days after the storm were spent in a strange, exhausted combination of grief and gratitude that I don't think I have adequate words for even now. The fleet had lost 11 people confirmed, with several more missing and presumed lost in the chaos of that night, including, I learned later, 2 members of Curtis's own crew, which apparently shifted something in how Curtis himself approached the fleet's internal politics afterward. Harold told me, weeks later, that Curtis had become noticeably quieter, less aggressive about his absorption philosophy, as though watching real losses happen under his own command had stripped away some of the abstract certainty he'd been operating from before. We lost nothing structural that couldn't be repaired within days, and we lost no one, which, given everything that night had thrown at us, felt like a miracle I genuinely didn't think we'd earned through skill alone. Some of it was skill, hard-won over 4.5 months of mistakes and lessons. Some of it, I have to be honest, was luck. The same kind of luck that put Gary's bite on his forearm rather than somewhere that would have made immediate treatment impossible. The same kind of luck that had our defensive line hold just long enough in just the right places. In the weeks that followed, the alliance between our barge and Russell's fleet didn't just survive that storm. It deepened in a way that felt fundamentally different from the cautious, transactional relationship we'd had before. Shared crisis has a way of cutting through political maneuvering that careful diplomacy alone never quite manages, and Russell himself acknowledged as much when we finally sat down together, exhausted and grieving, and grateful all at once, about a week after the storm passed. He told me, in that conversation, that he'd come to believe, watching how our small crew had held our position and helped where we could during the worst of that night, that the original instinct he'd had on our very first meeting, calling us a group that had come to him already standing rather than broken and needing to be rebuilt, had been more right than even he'd realized at the time. He offered, formally, a deeper partnership than the trade alliance we'd originally negotiated. Genuine mutual defense commitment, permanent rather than situational, with our barge maintaining full independence over its own decisions, but functioning, in practice, as a recognized and valued part of the fleet's overall defensive network, rather than just a loosely connected trading partner. I accepted, this time without the lengthy internal debate that had marked our first decision, because 5 months of hard, often brutal experience had taught me something I genuinely hadn't fully understood when I'd started welding plates onto that derelict barge back at Port Fourchon, alone, telling no one what I was actually building. I'd thought, back then, that survival meant self-sufficiency, meant minimizing dependence on anyone else, meant building something that could stand entirely on its own, because the world had shown, again and again in those early weeks, exactly how dangerous trusting other people could be. What I'd learned since, through Gary's near-death and recovery, through Patricia's growing expertise that none of us could have developed alone, through Dale's quiet transformation from a traumatized young deckhand into someone who held a defensive line without flinching, through Harold's hard-won wisdom about both the sea and the people on it, and through watching an imperfect, politically complicated, occasionally fractured fleet still manage to hold together and protect its people through the worst single night any of us had faced since this all began, was that survival, real survival, the kind that lasts longer than a few desperate months, was never actually going to be a solitary thing. It was going to require exactly the kind of careful, hard-earned trust we'd built, tested under fire, and chosen to deepen rather than abandon. We're still out here. The barge I built alone in secret, telling no one, certain I was probably being paranoid for nothing, is still floating, still home, now permanently linked to something larger than I ever imagined when I started welding those first reinforcement plates onto a forgotten hull at a dead client's leased slip. Gary's arm healed clean, with a scar he shows off now with the kind of dark humor that I think helped him process what almost happened to him better than solemn reflection ever could have. Patricia's garden, rebuilt twice now after 2 separate storms, is doing better than ever, expanded with techniques she's traded for and learned from the fleet's own growing operation. Dale runs half the fleet's combined engineering projects now, in addition to keeping our own systems running, something that would have seemed impossible to imagine in that traumatized young man on the skiff after his first kill. Harold still tells the same handful of sea stories, slightly different details every time depending on his mood, and none of us ever correct him on the inconsistencies because honestly, at this point, hearing him tell them at all feels like its own small victory against everything that's tried to take this from us. I don't know what's still coming. I learned a long time ago, back when I was still calculating safe loading margins for a derelict barge nobody else thought was worth the effort, that you don't get to know the future. You only get to prepare for it as honestly and carefully as you can, and then adapt when it inevitably surprises you anyway. The world that's left out there is still full of danger, still full of those mindless, endless things that never stop coming once they've started, and still, in some ways more dangerously, full of people who might or might not turn out to be worth trusting. But I've got a working barge, a working alliance, 5 months of hard lessons under my belt, and people around me I trust with my life, because I've already had to, more than once, more than I ever expected to when I started this whole thing alone, with a welding torch, and a feeling I couldn't fully explain to anyone, including myself. That's where I'll leave this account for now, not because the story's over. I don't think anyone gets to say that anymore, not in this world, but because this is as good a stopping point as I've found since everything started. We're still here, we're still building, and for the first time in a long while, that feels like it might actually be enough. A few more things happened before I decided to actually close this account, and I think they belong here, at the end, because they're the parts that finally let me stop holding my breath about the future and start, for the first time, actually planning one. About 2 weeks after the alliance deepened, Russell called what he described as a full assembly, every available vessel gathered in close formation, which by itself told everyone something significant was coming, because fuel was too precious to waste on ceremony unless it actually mattered. He stood on the deck of that converted supply ship, looking out at all of us, scattered across our individual boats, and told the fleet plainly what Eleanor and Reginald had finally confirmed after months of careful, quiet work. The infection, whatever its origin, appeared to burn itself out in a host within roughly 18 to 20 months, if that host never came into contact with open water or fresh blood to transmit further. Isolated, stranded ones on land, cut off from new victims, were already, in documented cases the researchers had tracked through scattered radio reports and their own careful long-range observation, beginning to simply stop. Not cured, not reversed, just spent, finally, the way a fire runs out of anything left to burn. It wasn't victory. Nobody on that water mistook it for victory, and Russell didn't dress it up as one. But it meant something we hadn't let ourselves hope for in any concrete way before. An actual horizon, a point in time, however far off, when the land itself might start going quiet again, when the thing chasing humanity into the water might finally run down like a wound-up toy with nothing left to power it. Curtis, of all people, was the one who asked the obvious hard question out loud in front of everyone. Quiet didn't mean safe, didn't mean clean, didn't mean ready, and a fleet that had built its entire structure around staying afloat couldn't just turn around one day and walk back onto land like none of this had happened. Russell agreed with him completely, which I think surprised people more than the disagreement would have, and said that was exactly why they needed the next year, however long it took, to keep building, keep strengthening the alliance network on the water, so that whenever the day actually came, there'd be an organized, capable group ready to go back and start something real, instead of scattered survivors stumbling onto quiet streets with no plan at all. I went back to our own barge that night and sat at the bow for a long while, the way I had the day after we found Tom's name on that wall, except this time, the feeling sitting in my chest wasn't grief. It was something closer to the feeling I used to get finishing a stability calculation that finally balanced out clean after hours of frustrated revision. Not joy exactly, just the quiet, solid relief of watching numbers that finally hold. Patricia found me there and sat down without saying anything for a while, which by then had become its own kind of language between us. Eventually, she said that she'd already started thinking about what an actual return to land would need to look like medically. Immunization concerns, sanitation, rebuilding some kind of basic care infrastructure from nothing. I told her that sounded like exactly the kind of problem worth losing sleep over for the right reasons, instead of the kind we'd been losing sleep over for the last 5 months. Dale's been talking, lately, about land-based water systems, the kind you'd need for an actual settlement instead of a boat, and he's already sketched half a design on the back of one of his old logbook pages, like he can't help himself, even though we're still a long way from needing it. Harold just laughs at both of them and says the sea isn't done with any of us yet, that we'll be living on hulls a good while longer before any of this turns into dry ground and front porches, and he's probably right. But I notice he doesn't say it like it troubles him anymore. Gary still has the scar on his forearm, pale and ridged, and he still makes the same joke every time someone new joins the fleet and asks about it. Tells them a fish bit him, watches their face, then tells them the truth once they've sat with the lie a second too long, like he's decided that's the proper way to introduce people to how strange and brutal this world actually is, a little at a time, the same way it taught the rest of us. As for me, I keep thinking back to that first night, anchored a mile off a coastline that was going dark, building by building, watching something that used to be a person claw its way onto a broken piling and just hang there, moaning at us across the water. I didn't know then what any of this would turn into. Didn't know if I was building a tomb or a lifeboat or just an elaborate, expensive way to die slightly later than everyone on shore. I know now it was none of those things alone. It was a start, a hull that held when it needed to hold, a handful of strangers who became the closest thing to family I have left in this world, and an alliance built slow, tested hard, and somehow still standing on the other side of the worst night any of us have lived through. The land's still out there, quiet in places it shouldn't be quiet yet, loud in places that'll take a long time to go silent. We're not going back today, and probably not for a long while yet. But for the first time since I welded that first reinforcement plate onto a dead client's forgotten barge, certain I was just a paranoid fool wasting his savings, I can picture an actual day when we do. That's where I'm ending this, not with an answer to everything still out there waiting, because I don't have one, and I've stopped pretending I will. Just with this. We built something that held. We're still here, and for now, on water that used to terrify me and now just feels like home. That's enough.